Chapter 2. The First Steps of Historiography in Zion. When Barron's book appeared in the 1930s, Yitzhak Behr was asked to review it in the periodical Zion, which was launched in late 1935 in Jerusalem. Behr had come to Palestine from Germany in 1929, and whereas Barron was the first occupant of an American chair in Jewish history, Behr possessed a similar position at the Young Hebrew University in Jerusalem. This may have accounted for the restrained and respectful tone with which the new Palestinian academic referred to his distinguished and influential colleague in New York. It did not, however, camouflage the hard core of his criticism. The Jewish historian, he wrote, must discover in the biblical period the inner forces destined to continue to operate in the different and changing conditions of the later periods. Barron has located in the early chapter of Jewish history the same fixed pattern under which he proceeds to follow the history of the exile up to the present. By doing this, he has barred its organic understanding. Barron had read the biblical history through the lens of an exile, Behr is saying, when he should have done the opposite. The key to understanding the history of the Jews must be found in the concept that he, Behr, following his German teachers, dubbed organic. This meant a homogeneous approach with a biological tinge, which declared that it was necessary, first of all, to determine the origin of the human subjects in order to find the thread of their progress through history. The history of the Jews had an organic sequence, which bound all its stages, from inception to the present, into a single entity. Despite Barron's considerable scholarship and vivid style, he had sinned by failing to understand those inner forces of the Jewish nation that had arisen in ancient times and continued to animate it till the present. Barron had detached Jewish monotheism from its homeland in the first stage of its appearance, and then erroneously depicted an idealized and fairly comfortable exile. There was no description in his work of the longing for a natural existence in the homeland, or the aspiration for sovereignty that had accompanied and defined the Jews throughout their wanderings in history. In 1936, 2 years before writing this review, Behr had published in Berlin his book Galut, meaning exile in Hebrew, a kind of theoretical précis of all his future historiographical work. The book opened with the assertion that the Bible had told of the slow process of selection and ripening that took place among God's people. It confirmed their claim to the promised land of Palestine and showed them their special place in the history of the nations. Galut concludes with a credo so formative in the shaping of future Jewish-Israeli historical consciousness that it merits being quoted at length: God gave to every nation its place, and to the Jews he gave Palestine. The Galut means that the Jews have left their natural place. But everything that leaves its natural place loses thereby its natural support until it returns. The dispersion of Israel among the nations is unnatural. Since the Jews manifest a national unity, even in a higher sense than other nations, it is necessary that they return to a state of actual unity. The Jewish revival of the present day is in its essence not determined by the national movements of Europe. It harks back to the ancient national consciousness of the Jews, which existed before the history of Europe, and is the original sacred model for all the national ideas of Europe. If we today can read each coming day's events in ancient and dusty chronological tables, as though history were the ceaseless unrolling of a process proclaimed once and for all in the Bible, then every Jew in every part of the diaspora may recognize that there is a power that lifts the Jewish people out of the realm of all causal history. This was not written by an eloquent Zionist leader or activist, or a hyperbolic romantic poet. This was written by the first professional scholar of Jewish history in Jerusalem, who taught and mentored many students. The fact that it was published in Nazi Germany is also significant in analyzing the character and components of the special national identity that bursts from it. If Graetz in his writing opposed Treitschke, Behr in his writing opposed the German historians who had formed him, and who by and large greeted the new Nazi regime with understanding, if not enthusiasm. In 1936 the expulsion of Jews from the feverish body of the German nation was at one of its high points, and the Zionist historian, harshly rejected by his native Germany, completed the process by developing a painful counter-consciousness. Ironically, this self-consciousness drew on the same imaginary idea of nationhood that had nurtured his mentors for several generations, that the source determines the substance, and the goal is a return to the roots, the primeval habitat, be it Teutonic or Hebrew. For Bear, the biblical myth that indicated the origin embraced a distinct national telos that had previously seemed sheepish and timid, leaving the places of alienated exile and returning to the warm womb of the land that had given birth to the chosen people, whose proprietary claim to it was ultimately borne out by the Bible. The year Galut was published, there occurred an academic event that would determine the character of all future historiography in Israel. While it generally followed the European model of academe, the Hebrew University decided to create not one but two history departments, one named Department of Jewish History and Sociology, the other, Department of History. All the history departments of all the other universities in Israel followed suit. Jewish history was to be studied in isolation from the history of the Gentiles, because the principles, tools, concepts and time frame of these studies were completely different. Bear at first objected to this strange academic division but soon became its devoted supporter, as it actually suited his approach to history. The year before this fateful decision was taken, he had launched, together with Benzion D. Nur, Dinah Berg, the other historian who obtained a position in the Jewish History Department in Jerusalem, the magazine Zion, which came to be the leading venue for discussions of Jewish history in Mandatory Palestine, and later in independent Israel Zmonim, Times, the first periodical in Hebrew to deal with general history, was founded in Israel only in the late 1970s. As the above quotations show, Bear saw the Bible as the decisive starting point of the organic development of the entire Jewish past. Yet he did not specialize in ancient history but in the Middle Ages. Only later, in the 1960s, did he turn to the Hasmonean kingdom. The age of grand syntheses had passed, and no individual professional historians in the Hebrew academic world would undertake on their own to repeat the pioneering projects of Greats, Dubnoff, and Barron. The requirements of the international academic world, especially in the latter half of the 20th century, forced on the young Hebrew scholars certain norms that could not be easily circumvented. Bear, a cautious pedant in his empirical work, he was a typical product of German academia, and a diligent explorer of archives, always asserted that he was professionally committed to the facts. He therefore admitted that Julius Wellhausen and his colleagues had eroded the biblical historical discourse, which may have caused his hesitation about dealing directly with the biblical period. At the same time, his duty as a national historian prevented him from undermining the founding myth, and prompted him to write the following: Greats was the only Jew who wrote out of an original and independent understanding of Israelite history up to the fall of the First Temple, and but for the revolutionary conclusions that were reached in his final years in Bible criticism, and the history of the period. The first two volumes of his work would have been rightly regarded as among the finest books about that time, and from the viewpoint of the profession's development, will always remain interesting. The contradiction contained in this statement clearly expressed the dilemmas and tensions experienced by one of the founders of national historiography in Israel. He constantly swung between the mythological and the scientific, with the former remaining predominant, though periodically defeated by naughty little facts. Thus, in the 1950s, when the cult of Israel's past turned the nationalized Bible into a tribal campfire story, and fostered imaginings of reliving that past anew, Bear, the first Zionist Palestinian historian, joined the general exultation and endowed it with precious scientific reinforcement. Without the biblical period we cannot understand the history of the Jewish people. The biblical period serves as a model and pattern for the following periods. We know that the last two generations have seen a great development in the study of the biblical period. In the view that was widely accepted 50 years ago, the Israelites began as a nation like any other, and the theocratic tendency in its character appeared, according to that view, as the product of a late development, from shortly before and after the fall of the First Temple. The biblical tradition, that depicted the early stage of the nation, the time of the patriarchs and the wilderness generation, as a primeval ideal was a construction unfounded in historical reality. This school of thought in Jewish history had been rejected by modern research. The accepted positions in Bible research today regard the patriarch Abraham as a historical figure who led a religious community, and was the archetype and first spiritual teacher of the reforming movement of the classical prophets. The ideal depiction of the Israelites in the desert, encamped around the tabernacle with the cloud of God leading them, cannot be entirely a product of the late imagination. This resounding historical assertion was shared by Bear's colleague and close friend, the historian Dino. But the latter, who was the more dominant personality, was far less inhibited by the shackles imposed by the invention of the nation. Indeed, he was instrumental in forging them. If Graetz was responsible for the foundation and scaffolding of the retroactive construction of the Jewish nation, Dino laid the bricks, hung the beams, and fitted the windows and doors. He did this in two ways. As a teacher of Jewish history, he took part with Bear in shaping the power relations in this field of research. As a party-cultural activist in the Zionist left, a member of the First Knesset, and from 1951 the Minister of Education for the State of Israel, he was the chief architect of all history studies in the Hebrew educational systems. Dino, who was born in the Ukraine, attended a yeshiva in Vilnius, and studied history in Germany, began his distinctive historiographic project before his appointment as a lecturer at the Hebrew University in the 1930s. Already in 1918, 3 years before his emigration to British-ruled Palestine, he had published in Kiev the book Toldot Yisrael, History of Israel, the first volume of his life's work as a scholar. A compilation of sources and documents through which could be delineated a continuous, organic narrative of the history of the Jews. This project would culminate later in Yisrael Bar Golah, Israel in Exile, the instructive series of volumes intended to cover the totality of Jewish history. The many varied documents were organized and presented in a chronological and thematic order. Most were accompanied by succinct interpretations, guiding the Hebrew readers in the organic reading of history. This compilation could in some ways be regarded as the culmination of Graetz's pioneering enterprise. Whereas the work of the German Jewish historian was a nonconformist challenge to the predominant views held by educated people of Jewish background in Germany, and even throughout Europe, Dino's compilation, like Salar Baron's, which appeared at almost the same time, was quickly accepted as the proper, standard historiography of the Jewish past. For Hebrew readers in Palestine, it became the dominant narrative, and any deviation from it, insofar as any appeared, would be viewed as peculiar or even hostile. From then on, the national historical truth would be presented not only in the writings of a handful of subjective historians, but in scientific, objective, and systematic documentation. As noted, Dino devoted the first volume of the History of Israel to the biblical period. After joining the Hebrew University he revised it, expanded it, and began to publish it under the title The History of Israel, Israel in its Land. For all the differences between the 1918 edition and the first volume of the expanded edition of 1938, their method of creating positivist credibility for the history was identical. Dino divided the Old Testament into sections and organized his book as a system of quotations from the biblical stories, interspersed with additional materials, a handful of epigraphic documents discovered in archaeological excavations in the Near East, a few quotes from Greek and Roman historians, brief commentaries from the Talmud. It opens, naturally, with a discussion of the name the Land of Israel and the promised broad expanse, then proceeds to describe the arrival of the Hebrews, their migration to Egypt, their return, their conquest of the inheritance promised to them, the founding of the United Kingdom, and so forth. Every biblical verse is quoted as reliable evidence about the period it describes. The theology is almost eliminated, and the Word of God, which appears on almost every page in the Bible, is replaced in part by one or another of the few extra-biblical sources mentioned. Dino discarded the religious metaphysics of the Holy Book and turned it into a straightforward national historical credo. Henceforth, impatient readers could skim the Old Testament, skipping the divine precepts and following the national truth alone. In fact, this compilation reveals that although Dinur had begun his professional career as a teacher of the Bible, 84 he did not trust it as a pedagogical tool. Hence his decision to rewrite it, adapting it to the science of the time. This does not mean he doubted the historicity of the ancient texts. He accepted every detail and event, from Abraham the Hebrew to the return to Zion. He totally rejected the Wellhausen school of Bible criticism, being convinced that the stories of the patriarchs were not projections from the time of the prophets, but residues from generations and periods preceding the patriarchs. He even believed, in contrast to current opinion, that the earliest historians were not the Greeks but the ancient biblical authors, and as a professional scholar felt able to assert without hesitation. Biblical historiography introduced an important theoretical innovation into general historiography by combining three elements. A. Factual accuracy: the events are God's secret and may not be used imprecisely. B. The use of archival and official sources. C. A pragmatic method in perceiving and explaining things. That is why we may regard the biblical historiography of the period of monarchy, more than any other, as the beginning of modern historiography. That ancient and almost scientific historiography, which as noted was slightly corrected by the national historian in Jerusalem, was meant to reveal the unique ethnic, religious, social, geographic, linguistic and political origin of the Jewish nation. For Dinur, historical writing was primarily a national autobiography, enlisted history. That was why he maintained that Zionist scholars should reject the division into Hebrew and Jewish histories, a division employed by non-Jewish scholars, and indeed should emphasize the homogeneous continuity in the emergence and development of the people of Israel from its inception to the present. The most important contribution of biblical historiography to the creation of a national consciousness was, of course, its affirmation of the connection to the land of Israel. This spacious land, which naturally included the Bashan and Gilead, east of the Jordan River, was exclusively the land of the people of Israel, and what better testimony than the Bible to prove the Jews' historical claim to this land, which was promised to them alone. Like Bear, but even more passionately, Dinur had recourse to the scriptures to prove the centrality of the land of Israel in the life of the nation, which had longed to return to it throughout its long exile. The nationalization of the Bible, and its transformation into a reliable history book began with Heinrich Graetz's romantic impetus, developed with diasporic cautiousness by Dubnoff and Baron, and completed and perfected by the founders of Zionist historiography, who played a significant role in the ideological appropriation of the ancient territory. The first historians who wrote in modern Hebrew, which they erroneously believed to have evolved directly from biblical language, were now regarded as the custodians and excavators of the Jewish nation's long memory.